Bob Lazar. I mean, just saying the name, it instantly brings up Area 51, UFOs, secret government projects.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
His story really became the cornerstone for modern Area 51 mythology, didn't it? It just exploded into pop culture.
it really did. And it's fueled so many conspiracy theories for decades now. It tapped into something, that idea of hidden knowledge, government secrets.
And the ultimate question, are we alone? His claims hit all those points. It's a powerful narrative, regardless of, well, the evidence.
Exactly. So that's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to focus specifically on Bob Lazar's claims. We've looked at analyses, his own accounts, things like his book, Dreamland.
And our mission really is to sift through it all. Based on what's available, does the story hold up? Is it likely genuine or mostly fabricated?
Let's start with the man himself, Bob Lazar. Because his credibility, everything he says about alien tech, it all rests on his claimed background, his expertise.
That's the linchpin. He claimed master's degrees from MIT in physics and Caltech in electronics, top-tier institutions.
Credentials that would certainly make you listen if someone started talking about reverse engineering alien spacecraft.
Precisely. It lends that immediate weight. But
Yeah, here's the but. People looked into it. Investigators like George Knapp initially, and especially Stanton Friedman, they contacted MIT and Caltech.
And the results were, well, definitive. Zero record. Absolutely nothing showing a Bob Lazar attended either place, let alone got a degree.
That's the huge hole right at the start, isn't it? If your whole story relies on being this highly qualified scientist.
It's foundational. It undermines everything that follows, really. If the credentials aren't real, why should we trust the incredibly technical details he provides later?
And Friedman, he didn't stop there. He looked at Lazar's high school record.
Yeah, and found it was, let's say, less than stellar. Graduated late, bottom third of his class, apparently took only one science course.
Not exactly the typical profile for getting into MIT or Caltech's graduate programs.
Friedman argued it was basically impossible. The leap just doesn't make sense academically.
Then there was this Professor Lazar mentioned, William Duxler, supposedly from Caltech.
Right, Duxler. But it turns out Duxler actually taught at Pierce Junior College, which, interestingly, Lazar did attend for a time.
Okay, so he named a real person, but put him at the wrong, more prestigious institution.
Exactly. And Pierce is in California, MIT is in Massachusetts. Friedman pointed out, you can't physically be a full-time student at both simultaneously. The timelines just don't work.
It feels like an attempt to borrow credibility, but it kind of backfired when checked.
It does seem that way. It's a specific detail that crumbles under scrutiny.
Okay, moving on to his work history. Los Alamos National Laboratory, LANL, huge secretive facility. He claimed he worked there as a physicist.
And officially, LANL says no, he wasn't employed as a physicist there. Flat denial.
But supporters point to something, right? George Knapp found his name
in a 1982 LANL phone directory. Yes, that's often cited as proof he was there, in some capacity.
But again, Friedman looked closer at that listing.
He did. And he noticed the notation, KM, next to Lazar's name. Friedman's interpretation, Kirkmeyer, a known subcontractor for LANL.
So maybe Lazar was at Los Alamos, but working for an outside company. As a technician, perhaps, not a staff physicist.
That's what Friedman argued, and it fits the evidence better than Lazar's claim of being a direct LANL physicist. Knapp did mention seeing LANL people greet Lazar like they knew him.
Which could still fit if he was a regular subcontractor on site.
Exactly. It doesn't necessarily confirm he was a high-level physicist involved in top-secret projects. The level of access and role is key.
He also claimed EG&G, the big defense contractor, interviewed him for the S-4 job, and that ultimately the Navy was his employer there.
And again, EG&G and the Navy were checked. No records found. Same pattern.
So how does Lazar explain all this? The missing degrees, the employment records?
Well, this is where we get the explanation laid out in his book, Dreamland. The government, he says, systematically erased everything. His school records, job records, even his birth certificate, supposedly. All to discredit him.
The deep state scrubbing the records. It's a narrative you hear a lot in these kinds of stories.
It is. And it's effectively unfalsifiable, isn't it? How do you prove records weren't deleted? The lack of evidence becomes the evidence for the conspiracy.
Right. It's a perfect defense in some ways. Now, there was that local newspaper article, the Los Alamos Monitor in '82, that did call him a physicist at LAMPF, a part of Los Alamos.
True, and supporters point to that. But Friedman suggested, again, context matters. Lazar had this personal project, a jet-powered car, that gained some local attention.
Ah, so the paper might have just used the description Lazar gave them, related to his jet car project and him being physically at the lab as a subcontractor, not reflecting an official job title.
That was Friedman's take. Public perception versus official employment status. It's plausible.
And then, separate from all the UFO stuff, there are his legal troubles.
Yes, his criminal record. A conviction in 1990 related to involvement in prostitution, and another in 2006 for selling restricted chemicals.
Now, obviously, that doesn't automatically mean his S4 story is false,
Yeah.
But it does factor into an overall assessment of his credibility and truthfulness. It suggests a willingness to operate outside legal boundaries.
So just looking at Lazar's background, before we even get to the aliens, you see this pattern. Claims made, often quite specific, but they consistently fall apart when investigated.
Absolutely. The foundation seems incredibly shaky. And that's crucial when he asks us to believe something truly extraordinary happened next.
Okay, let's shift to that. The core of the legend, S4.
No.
What did he actually claim went on there?
So S4, according to Lazar, was this ultra-secret facility near Papoose Lake, which is south of the main Area 51 base. It wasn't Area 51 itself, but nearby.
Hidden away.
Very. He described hangars built right into the side of a mountain, completely camouflaged.
And his job.
He said he was brought in as part of a small team to help understand and reverse engineer alien technology. Specifically, one of 9 captured extraterrestrial spacecraft they supposedly had stored there.
9 discs. Wow, and he focused on one.
Yes, the one he famously called the sport model. He gave quite vivid descriptions, said it looked like it was made of liquid titanium. Seamless.
And the inside.
Really cramped, he said. Like, it was designed for beings with, quote, childlike proportions. That detail always stood out.
And he claims he saw it fly.
He does. He described witnessing a test flight, mentioned a hissing sound, a bright blue corona discharge underneath it as it lifted off, and said it wobbled a bit initially before stabilizing.
Very specific details again.
Incredibly specific. And he went deep into the supposed propulsion system.
Right. This is where element 115 comes in.
The heart of it. He claimed the craft ran on an antimatter reactor powered by a stable isotope of element 115.
Stable. That's important.
Crucial. And he claimed this stable element 115 couldn't be synthesized on Earth. It had to be extraterrestrial. He even said the government had to stockpile 500 pounds of it.
500 pounds of an alien element. That's quite a claim. And this element powered the ship how?
By generating gravity waves, he said. It allowed the ship to warp space-time for propulsion and even bend light around itself, creating a kind of invisibility or cloaking effect.
He talked about different modes too, right? Gravity A and gravity B.
Yes, operational modes for the gravity amplifiers, as he called them. During that test flight he supposedly saw, he described 3 emitters on the bottom.
Okay.
The one pointing down, he said, created that blue corona and seemed to stabilize it. He even noted being puzzled about how radio communication could work near such intense gravity fields.
It sounds very technical. Almost plausible if you don't know the physics.
That's part of the appeal, the sheer level of technical jargon and detail. It sounds authoritative.
And then the aliens themselves, did he claim to see them?
This is a really interesting and somewhat shifting part of the story. Initially, his account was quite dramatic. He described looking through a doorway or a window and seeing 2 men in lab coats facing down and talking to something small with long arms.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like direct contact, or at least observation.
It certainly implied it. That became a huge part of the lore. Lazar saw an alien at S4.
But he changed that story later.
He did. Later on, he clarified revised it. He said he did not think he saw an alien. Maybe it was a doll, he suggested, used as a reference for the size of the aliens. The project staff apparently nicknamed the alleged aliens the Kids.
So, from seeing something small with long arms to maybe seeing a reference doll, that's a pretty significant backtracking on a key claim.
It absolutely is. It casts doubt on the reliability of his memory, or perhaps his initial telling of the story. Either way, it weakens that specific claim considerably.
The specificity of everything he described, though, about the craft, the propulsion, while it makes the story compelling, it also makes it testable, right?
Exactly. He didn't just say alien ship. He gave details, mechanisms, elements. And that's where science can step in. He also compared S4 security to the Manhattan Project.
Extreme compartmentalization, need-to-know basis for everything.
Right. Which on one hand is plausible for a top-secret project. On the other hand, it's also a convenient way to explain why nobody else who allegedly worked there has ever come forward to back up his specific story about reverse engineering alien craft.
Oh, they're in a different compartment. They wouldn't know what I was doing.
Precisely. It works both ways.
Okay, let's pivot to that science then. Element 115. This feels absolutely central to his claims.
It really is. So, recap. Lazar claimed stable element 115, impossible to make on Earth, fueled an antimatter reactor, generated gravity waves, government had 500 pounds, and he even gave a melting point, 1740 degrees Celsius.
A very specific melting point.
Yes. And remember, he made these claims back in 1989. He also later in 2014 dismissed the early scientific findings about the element when it was synthesized.
Okay, so what is the actual science of element 115? It has a name now, right?
It does. Moscovium symbol Makia. It was first successfully synthesized, confirmed in 2003 by a collaboration of Russian and American scientists.
So first off, it can be synthesized on Earth. Lazar was wrong about that.
Correct. It's man-made. And its properties are, well, completely different from what Lazar described.
How so?
Moscovium is super heavy, yes, but it's incredibly unstable. All known isotopes are highly radioactive and decay extremely fast. We're talking half-lives measured in milliseconds or fractions of a second.
Milliseconds. Not exactly stable fuel for a spaceship.
Not at all. And it's produced literally one atom at a time in giant particle accelerators. By 2015, maybe only around 50 atoms had ever been created and detected. Definitely not 500 pounds worth.
Okay, so unstable, incredibly rare, decays almost instantly. What about the melting point? His 1740 C.
The predicted melting point for Moscovium is much, much lower, around 400 degrees Celsius. So another major discrepancy.
Dr. Jacqueline Gates, you mentioned her research.
Yes, she's a prominent researcher in synthesizing these super heavy elements. Her work confirms these basic properties highly unstable, very short-lived. Now, there is a theoretical concept called the island of stability.
Where some super heavy elements might be more stable.
Might be, theoretically. But, and this is the key point, no such long-lived or stable isotopes of Moscovium have ever been found or created. The science as we know it directly contradicts Lazar's description of a stable, usable element 115.
It seems like a fatal flaw in his scientific claims. The core element he described just doesn't match reality, and his reaction in 2014 dismissing the actual findings.
That's just not how science works, is it? When new data comes along, you incorporate it, you adjust theories, you don't just dismiss it because it contradicts your prior story. It seems quite antithetical to the scientific process.
So the core science claim seems busted, but hasn't there been any attempt to scientifically validate any part of his physics? I think I read something about Storti.
Ah, yes. Riccardo Storti. He has self-published some papers, mostly on platforms like ResearchGate, not in mainstream peer-reviewed journals.
Okay. And what does he claim?
He claims he found some mathematical validation for Lazar's specific gravity B-wave frequency claim. He uses his own theoretical model called the electrogravimagnetic construct, or EGM, which is based on something called the polarizable vacuum model, or PV model.
Polarizable vacuum? That doesn't sound like standard physics.
It isn't. The PV model is generally considered fringe physics. It's not accepted by the mainstream scientific community. There are criticisms about its consistency with observations and other established theories.
So Storti is using a non-mainstream theory to try and validate one specific frequency claim from Lazar.
Essentially, yes. And interestingly, Storti himself says his validation doesn't require element 115 or even aliens to be true.
And the peer review. You said ResearchGate.
Right. There's a note about a peer review by someone named Evan Roy on ResearchGate, but that's not the same rigorous, independent, blind peer review process used by established scientific journals. It lacks that level of scrutiny.
So bottom line, Storti's work, while maybe interesting to some, doesn't count as mainstream scientific validation of Lazar's claims.
No, it doesn't. The broader physics and aerospace communities haven't embraced Lazar's descriptions. The focus really remains on the fundamental implausibility of his core element 115 claims.
Okay, so the background is shaky, the science seems largely debunked. What about witnesses? Corroboration, that's always key.
Absolutely. And George Knapp is central here again. He broke the story in Las Vegas in 1989.
He did some checks back then, right? Though he initially reported the MIT degree claim, which turned out false.
He did. And he reported seeing Lazar greeted at LANL, as we mentioned. Over the years, Knapp has remained Lazar's most prominent supporter, eventually co-authoring Lazar's autobiography, Dreamland.
So his role evolved, maybe, from journalist to advocate.
It certainly appears that way to many observers. He seems deeply invested in Lazar's story being true.
On the flip side, you had Stanton Friedman, deeply skeptical from the get-go.
Friedman was relentless. He saw the inconsistencies in the background story, the lack of degrees, the Duxler issue, the subcontractor interpretation of the LANL phone book, and concluded Lazar had fabricated his credentials. He just didn't buy the erased records excuse at all.
So, starkly different approaches from Knapp and Friedman. But what about other people who supposedly worked with Lazar at S4?
This is perhaps the most critical point on corroboration. Lazar's book, Dreamland, and some early reports hinted at other potential witnesses, people who could back him up.
But have any come forward on the record saying, yes, I worked with Bob Lazar on alien craft at S4?
No, that's the crucial lack. Decades have passed, 30-plus years. If this massive world-changing project involving multiple people actually happened as Lazar described,
you'd think someone else would have talked by now, even anonymously with verifiable details.
it seems highly improbable that absolutely no one else involved in reverse engineering alien spacecraft would corroborate such a monumental claim. The complete silence from any alleged S4 colleagues is deafening, really.
Lazar's supporters often point to the consistency of his core story since 1989.
And it's true, the basic outline hasn't changed dramatically. But, as we discussed, key details have shifted, like the alleged alien sighting morphing from seeing something small to maybe seeing a doll.
That's a significant inconsistency in a supposedly consistent story.
It is. And consistency alone doesn't equal truthfulness, especially if the story was fabricated from the start.
He also popped up again around that Storm Area 51 thing in 2019, didn't he? Warning people away.
Yeah, he cautioned against it, saying people could get hurt, and mentioned S4 was what people were really thinking of, but implied its role was in the past.
And there was an FBI raid on his company, United Nuclear, in 2017.
Right. Lazar himself speculated it was the government coming after him, maybe related to Element 115 somehow.
But the official story was quite different.
Completely different. The FBI stated it was connected to a homicide investigation in Michigan where the victim was poisoned with thallium, and the thallium had been purchased from Lazar's company, United Nuclear. Lazar himself wasn't a suspect in the murder.
So a legitimate, if tragic, reason for the raid, but he interpreted it through the lens of his S4 narrative.
It seems to illustrate that tendency, yes.
Right.
Seeing the S4 conspiracy behind unrelated events.
Okay. So we've walked through Lazar's background, the S4 claims, the science, the lack of corroboration. It's a lot to take in. Where does this leave us?
Well, when you lay it all out, the findings are pretty stark, aren't they? You have the significant problems, the likely fabrications in his claimed education and work history.
Right. The foundation is weak.
Then you have the core scientific claims, stable element 115, which is fundamentally contradicted by actual established science.
And the attempts to validate parts of it rely on fringe theories, not mainstream science.
Exactly. And crucially, after more than 30 years, there's a complete absence of any verifiable, on-the-record corroboration from anyone who's supposedly worked with him on these extraordinary projects at S4.
So putting all those pieces together, based purely on the evidence and analyses available, the conclusion seems unavoidable.
It does. Based on this deep dive into the available material, the conclusion is that Bob Lazar's story is largely a fabrication.
And the reasoning is that pattern we saw. The deception about his background, the scientific impossibility of his central claims, the reliance on fringe ideas for any support, the lack of witnesses, and using unfalsifiable claims like erased records to explain away inconsistencies.
It all points in one direction. And given how central and specific the unsubstantiated claims are, the degrees, the element, the ships, it feels more like intentional invention rather than, say, misinterpretation or delusion.
Yet, despite all this evidence against the story, its impact is just undeniable.
Oh, absolutely. He put Area 51 on the map for millions, maybe billions of people. He's a giant figure in ufology and conspiracy culture. His story shaped how people think about government secrecy and aliens.
It's a fascinating case study, really, how a narrative, a compelling story, can take root and grow so powerful, even without solid evidence. It really shows the power of myth-making in the modern age.
It does. And it leads to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to ponder. Considering how popular Lazar's story remains, despite decades of debunking and a lack of proof, what does that persistence tell us about ourselves, about our collective desire to believe?
What does it reveal about our fascination with government secrets, cover-ups, and the profound hope, or maybe fear, that we're not alone in the universe?
That deep-seated need to believe in something extraordinary, perhaps. It's a question that lingers long after the details of Element 115 fade.